Very very welcome to our fireside this evening. We'll be talking about the saga of Sadiq Khurasani, an apostle for all ages. So I'm welcoming all of you on behalf of fireside.org, our website that prepares firesides about various subjects related to the Baha'i Faith. Um, Tonight's theme is about the saga of Sadiq Khurasani, an apostle for all ages. As you know, the 19th century saw incredible change in every aspect of mankind's progress in the arts and crafts, in the religious movements, in the realm of science in general, in the realm of philosophy. But there are aspects of these changes that are related to the fulfillment of prophecies that were expected to occur at this time. So, in a number of ways, the revolution that happened in the Middle East, in the Far East, and in the Western society was expected for millennia. One of such transformations occurred in the middle of the century in Iran with the appearance of the Babi Faith, which offered new perspective on a host of fundamental concepts such as religious truth, the purpose of religion, the role of religion in the life of human being and society, and so forth. From the beginning of that century, there were many signs of revolution in the Iranian society, but none of them with the strength of the Babi revelation. There were other changes as well, both political and in terms of the order of the Islamic and political system and forms of governance all over the world. There were changes happening in the West and in the East. But during that same time, uh, a, a group of disciples of the Babi Faith that was founded in 1844 saw the fulfillment of many such reforms in the establishment of the teachings of their new faith. A handful of early believers in the Babi Faith played critical role in the establishment and spread of the Babi Faith, and later the Baha'i Faith. Considered to be one of a half a dozen foremost apostles among the contingent of early Babi Baha'i believers, Mulla Sadiq Mugaddas Khurasani was an erudite, scrupulously pious, and remarkable man who performed unparalleled acts of service that immortalized him in the annals of the Babi and Baha'i history. His role in the spread of the new faith is no less significant than those played by the few disciples of Christ in the spread of Christianity. He was referred to by Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, as the embodiment of my name, the Truthful, the Most Holy. Tonight we have Dr. Muin Afnani with us. Dr. Afnani is serving in the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States, and he has a background in engineering with a master's degree from the Utah State University and the University of Colorado. He also holds Master of Science degrees in sociology from Utah State University and in systems management and Islamic studies from the University of Southern California. His PhD is in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California, and he has written several research papers related to religious studies. In his career, he works as a manager of technology development in a semiconductor firm, having worked in the field of semiconductor development since '84. He lives with his wife, Soheila, and their children in Northern California. So, Dr. Muini, Dr. Afnani, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your precious research on this history and this subject with us tonight. The floor is yours. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, dear Nason. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. I'm delighted to be with you, even though about 2/3 of the screens are black. So I'm talking, to a few of the friends. I mean, many of them, but I can see only wonderful faces of only a few of them. And I wanted to express my gratitude to dear Nason for making this possible. When I was a teenager and I was studying the history of the Babi and later on Baha'i Faith, something that in Iran of those days, it was quite common, when you became a teenager, about 13, 14, 15, one of the first things that they would recommend to you, to study, to learn about the Baha'i Faith was to study the history of this new revelation. And I read about some of the early believers, and one that stood out among a handful, very few, was the story of Mulla Sadiq Mugaddas Khurasani. And of course, years later, I came to know of the descendants of this illustrious man. I met on a few occasions the dear father of Nason John, Janab Shapur Munajjim. And also my acquaintance with Nason, he may not know it, but it goes back to, I think about 3 perhaps international conventions ago. For some of the friends that may not be familiar with the system of Baha'i administration, because there is no clergy and priesthood in the Baha'i faith, the affairs of the community is relegated to some elected councils at the local level and at national level. And of course, there's an international body that's called the Universal House of Justice. And every 5 years, members of the national institutions gather in Haifa, Israel, to elect the members of the Universal House of Justice. And the reason I remember dear Nason, although he probably doesn't remember me from that time, is because of the about 190 different national spiritual assemblies whose members, and each national assembly has 9 members, many of which had gathered in Haifa. One of the most animated group was the National Spiritual Assembly of Brazil. And in different places, in the the break rooms and the dining room and all that, I was fascinated that how closely knit this National Assembly is, and they are so animated. They are not talking to each other and they're embracing each other. And some of us, from other countries are very reserved and holding back and all that. So anyway, that's the first time that I met the Nason. And of course, the 5 years later, I believe I also met him. And then in other occasions, I had the opportunity to do that. So I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to say a few words about this great man, Mulla Sadiq, that, as Nason John mentioned, has offered services that are truly historic. And I feel that he is probably among one of 4 people among the early believers of the Babi Faith, and among a handful later on of the Baha'i Faith. that stand out in terms of their service and their devotion and their dedication. I feel that even the Baha'i community doesn't know as much about this person as it should, because I think he is in the same category of people like Tahireh, Quddus, and Mullah Hussein. Mullah Hussein was the first person who accepted the Bab, the new revelation. Quddus was one of the 18 disciples, early disciples, that performed illustrious service to this new cause. And Tahireh was the only woman among the early apostles, early believers, that played significant role, not only in the advancement of the Babi community and the Babi faith, but also in social changes that were brought about as a result of her heroic acts. That itself is a topic of different discussion. Many of you are familiar with that. But I think that Baha'i friends know quite a bit about the first three, about Tahireh and Quddus and Mullah Hussein. And I think more has to be written about the role that Mulla Sadiq played. But before I get to that topic, to that discussion, as dear Nason read a brief background of the time in which Mulla Sadiq lived and offered his services, perhaps it would be helpful to put this into a context a little bit of what was happening in different parts of the world, in particular in the Western world, in Europe, and also in the Middle East. We see that from the end of the 17th century, as a result of some changes that had occurred, that in modern age may be referred to as Copernicus Revolution. You remember that Copernicus was the first person, one of the early people who advanced the theory that the sun, unlike what people believed unto that point, rotates in its own orbit and doesn't rotate around the earth. It is the earth that rotates around the sun. And some changes had occurred, and gradually we see that towards the end of 17th century, as a result of some activities that some progressive thinkers had engaged in, gradually various branches of knowledge, and in particular science, arts, various form of natural sciences, they become separated from religious studies and from philosophy. Although to this date, there's discussion among philosophers that, what is the relationship between science and philosophy, and is there true separation and how it developed and all that. But notwithstanding those issues, we see that gradually these sciences come out of the domain and influence of the church. And then gradually some people come and start writing about the nature of science, the nature of knowledge. How do we learn about reality? And this, of course, in following decades, many theories evolved, and many philosophers and sociologists, including some of the people who were active even in natural sciences, in biology, in zoology, and others, start speculating about the nature of reality. And also they write about the concept of faith and religion. And as you know, gradually this secular concept, secular movement evolves. And in the following decade, in the early 19th to mid and to late 19th century, we see the emergence of a number of philosophers and sociologists, many of whom reject religion. And this secular thought, secular movement becomes to some degree popular among these thinkers. And you're familiar, with the history of some of these, people like Karl Marx, like Friedrich Nietzsche, Camus, and of the latter ones like Vattimo, Gianni, Vattimo and others. They start speculating that in not too distant future, human beings will put aside religion, and religion will be relegated to the corners of some churches. And when human beings make enough progress and advancement in their thinking and their thought and become educated, completely religion will be wiped out. So this is part of some of the theories. Of course, there's a spectrum there. And at the one end of the spectrum, we have people who have purely materialistic thoughts, and they deny anything that is not materialistic. Their view is based on some principles such as reductionism. Some of them are nihilistic. They do not believe in any form of reality. They believe in annihilation of being. Some of them believe in another principle known as positivism, and another form of that positivism, which is called logical positivism. And what these mean, basically, in a very crude definition or explanation, the reductionism says that basically, in order to understand anything, you can understand its subparts. To understand a system, you can understand the elements of that system. And once you have understood the elements, you have understood the whole thing. For instance, a human being has organs, we have eyes and ears and heart and lungs and so on and so forth. So the study of these component parts together, once you have studied them well, then you have studied human beings. So this is what reductionists essentially viewed. The idea of positivism promoted, the philosophy of positivism promoted the idea that anything that is real can either be observed through senses or through logical reasoning. So if something cannot be observed through human senses, like we cannot hear it, we cannot see it, we cannot touch it, whatever, or through syllogism, logical syllogism and logical reasoning, we cannot prove its existence, doesn't exist. And nihilism, of course, has different forms. It has manifested itself in philosophies such as Buddhism. The reason I call it Buddhism a philosophy, not religion, because the major part of the Buddhist community today, they believe that Buddhism is a philosophy, not a religion. That's not a view that Baha'is, of course, hold, but anyway. So this is the view that on the one end of the spectrum, these secular progressive thinkers in Europe were thinking about. And they were thinking that in order to bring about meaningful change and progress in society, we have to do away with religion. And as you know, some of them, pronounced the death of God, and you're familiar with these secularist materialistic views. That trend continued until probably the first half, the middle of the 20th century. However, from the middle of the 20th century onward, some other secularistic philosophies promoted the idea that reality is not confined just to materialistic concepts and entities. There must be some other reality to the world in which we live. And although the number of them are increasing, these type of philosophers and sociologists, still most people in the world are not familiar with those ideas. When you hear about secularistic views and philosophies, most people think of purely materialistic views that denies anything that is not material and physical. But among these latter ones, even one of the early ones is a sociologist that you have heard of, Émile Durkheim, a French philosopher and sociologist, that although himself did not believe in organized religion, but he said that he cannot deny the existence of a spiritual reality. And many people after that, like for instance, one of the most famous philosophers and thinkers of the 20th century. Alistair McIntyre, whose writings on the nature of science and methodology of science has really influenced the way people think about the philosophy of science and the methodology of science. And he has written a number of books. He writes that there are concepts that we cannot deny them. For instance, he says that human conscience, and he argues in his writings that human conscience is not a physical entity. It is not a part of human brain that we call it conscience. Another philosophy that developed among people who do not subscribe to purely materialistic views is called holism, as opposed to reductionism. And this holism, for instance, given an analogy, argued that yes, we can study parts of a system. We can study the organs of a human being. But human life is something more than just the summation of one heart and 2 ears and 2 eyes and 2 hands and all that. Human being as a reality that supersedes the study of these parts. And these type of philosophers and thinkers argue that there are concepts in the world that do not lend themselves to purely materialistic study, that they cannot be studied through the senses, and they cannot be argued through logical reasoning, but we cannot deny their reality either. Concept of like intellect, like love, like emotions, like the power of imagination, the power to conclude intellectually things that we do not see. But from comparison of different things, we can, through the power of deduction or induction, we can arrive at certain realities that exist. So these are some of the things that were happening. Nonetheless, throughout the 18th and 19th century, the movements that were happening in the Western world, that to some degree also influenced other parts, but primarily centered in Europe and later in the United States, were based on these materialistic views. And they considered progression, progress, and evolution through these materialistic philosophies and views. Now, when we look at Iran, where Mulla Sadiq was born, we see that also some people started thinking about change because they were not satisfied with the status quo and what was happening. But majority of these people who consider themselves progressive thinkers and prescribed changes in society, their view was not along the views of religious change. Most of them, based on their experience, prescribed something different. For instance, in the early part of the 19th century, by 1812, Iran lost about a third of its territories as a result of 2 ill-advised wars to Russia. There was a dispute, and this dispute had existed from at least 200 years prior to that, from the period that another dynasty in Iran ruled, known as the Safavid dynasty. And there were always wars between these different regional powers, which consisted of the Ottoman Empire, of Russia, and of Iran. And they pretty much tried to control the identity of the dynasty at that time, the Iranian dynasty. They were able to maintain their national identity, although many other countries of the time, they essentially lost as a result of war and lost their identity, and they were absorbed either into the Russian Empire or into the Ottoman Empire. But Iran, although was attacked on one part from Russia and another part from some other places like the Tajiks and Mongols and Turkmens, and from the western part from the Ottoman Empire, nonetheless, they maintained their identity until the early part of the 19th century as a result of the advocacy of some Muslim clergy in Iran who told people that God is on our side and we should go to war. This is a jihad, this is a holy war with Russia, and no doubt that we will be successful. Needless to say that they were utterly defeated in 2 major battles. And as a result of that, they had to concede and give away about 1/3 of the northern territories of Iran to Russia. This was the first time that the idea of change and modernity, the discussion started in the Iranian community. However, that discussion was confined to changes in military and modernization of military complex infrastructure. So we go forward, we see that some other people come into the picture. Some of them were prime ministers of Iran, and they saw the change to some degree in the political system. They thought that in order to bring about meaningful change and change the society, there has to be changes in the political system. They did not dare to say that the monarch has to be overthrown, but they advocated different things, and you're familiar, some friends are familiar with some of these figures, people like Qa'im Maqam Farahani, people like Amir Kabir, people like Mustashar al-Dawleh, Mustafi al-Mamale, Sepahsalar Sadr Azam, Mirza Hussain Khan Mushir-ud-Dawla Sepahsalar. And then the later generation, the next generation of those, people like Sheikh Ahmad Ruhi, Agha Khan Kermani, even Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani, Mirza Malcolm Khan, who was an Armenian Iranian who pretended to have become a Muslim. And but these people were thinking through political avenues to bring about changes. Some of them, for instance, Mirza Hussain Khan Mushir-ud-Dawla, whom Baha'u'llah writes about him on few occasions, and he was one of the people that was responsible for the exile of Baha'u'llah from Iran to different places and his imprisonment. Nonetheless, Baha'u'llah says that although he had enmity towards us, but he was sincere in his wish to bring about improvement to the country. And for that reason, Baha'u'llah speaks favorably of him. I said he really wanted to bring about meaningful change to the country. And one of the things that he wanted to do, thought that in order to bring about change and progress, we have to change the judicial system. Because at that time, although the country had its own identity, but it really wasn't a national system of governance. It was a conglomeration of different rulers in different parts of the country. Like Isfahan had its own governor. Manusher Khan Mu'tamid-ud-Dawla was the governor of Isfahan and part of Fars. Khurasan had its own governor, and different provinces had their own governors. That's why the word that you read in the history, in those days they used to refer to Iran as Mamalik Mahruse Iran, the guarded domains of Iran. And if the country were to go to war, these governors had to agree, for instance, to send their troops or send their part of their money or wealth or other resources into the national entity. And these people had not only these governors, but also local governors, governors of city and all that. They had absolute power. There was no judicial system. There was a clandestine, haphazard, religious judicial system of priests, of Muslim clergy, who could rule on, about guilt or innocence of people, and there was no religious system. So this prime minister, this Mirza Hussain Khan, he thought that in order to bring about meaningful change, we should revitalize the judicial system and have trained judges that are trained in the style of European judges that can decide and answer. So this is. Some other people saw the reason for the, what they call the backwardness of the country at the time, that the country was steeped in Islamic terminology and culture. So people like Talibov, recommended that we should change the script and language of Iran and extract all the Arabic terms out of it. And if we did that, it will open the door to progress. And likewise, each of them had their own views. Some of them thought that, like Mirza Malcolm Khan and some others, they thought that in order to bring meaningful change, we should change the economic system. Because the economic system of the Qajar dynasty, 17th, 18th, 19th century of Iran, was dominated by the bazaris, the merchants of bazaar, who were in close relationship with the clergy. They would give part of their income, which they called khums, to the clergy, and clergy in turn would support the system of trade and economic system that existed at the time. So anyone who wanted to bring about a meaningful reform in economic structure of the country, because it was not beneficial to these bazaris, they would immediately oppose it, and the clergy that were behind them and supported them would sanction them as the system and thoughts of infidels. And said that the Muslim country like Iran doesn't need this, and system that we have served us well, and so on and so forth. So these are the thinkers that we're thinking about. There was a movement, as you're familiar with, known as the Shaky Movement. Someone by the name of Sheikh Ahmad Ahsai and later his successor, Sayyid Kazim Rashdi, they were saying that new changes will occur in religious field and new revelation will take place. Because as you know, there are prophecies in different religions about further revelations. Each religion, believes in some promised one and so on and so forth. So around 1840, when Sheikh Ahmad has passed away and Sayyid Kazim had a school in what is now Iraq, in the cities of, he had schools, religious schools in the city of Najaf and Karbala. A few of the more enlightened students of Islamic studies were attending this because they had heard that there is this leader, Sheikh Ahmad, and his successor, Sayyid Kazim, who are teaching these new ideas about concept of religion, that what religion should be in the life of people. And they are drastically different from what has been taught historically by religious leaders of Islam. So among these people who are attracted to that school is a young man who later on assumed the title of the Bab and was the founder of the Babi Faith. At this time, he is a young man. And he had lost his father in childhood, and his uncle raised him, his greater uncle, maternal uncle. And because the uncle thought that the Bab is not attentive to his religious studies and spending a lot of his time in basically prayer and meditation, he brings him to Najaf and Karbala to get engaged in religious studies. And many others at that period would do that. There was a saying among the people that in Persian, they said, "Ta ab Najaf و Karbala ro nakhorde bashid, alim waqi nemishid." If you haven't drank the water of Najaf and Karbala, meaning if you haven't spent time in Najaf and Karbala, where some of the greatest scholars of Shia Islam live there, and you attend their schools, you will not really attain to higher levels of Islamic education. There are three other individuals who attend these, and there are a number of others, of course. One of them is someone from Babel, later on assumes the title of Quddus. And one is Mullah Hussein Bushrui, who became the first believer in the Bab. But this is before all of these things taking place. They are attending the school of Sayyid Kazim. And here comes another gentleman who is probably about 2 to 3 years older than the rest of them. And his name is Mulla Sadiq. He has by that early age, in his early 20s, like he was probably 23, 24, something like that, he had already earned the title of Sadiq, the truthful, among the masses, because of the way he lived, because of his piety, his virtues. And he comes there to complete his religious education. And among those students, he stands out as perhaps the most learned. For that reason, and because of the fame that he had, on one occasion when the uncle of the Bab comes to Karbala to visit him, and he learns that Mulla Sadiq is also there, he arranges for a meeting between the Bab and Mulla Sadiq and Mulla Sadiq, and they meet, and the uncle of the Bab sort of confides in Mulla Sadiq that my nephew is not paying enough attention to religious studies, and sort of secretly ask him if he would sort of encourage and the Bab and make sure that he pays attention to his religious studies. And Mulla Sadiq, out of respect says, I will do that. But right there in that meeting, he develops great respect for the Bab. And later on, he never says anything to the Bab about, paying attention. And he is greatly influenced, affected by the demeanor of the Bab, by the way he carries himself and things that he asks or concepts that he says. For instance, when they were talking about some concepts, the Bab says, let's go to the shrine of Imam Hussein, which was the third Imam of the Shia Islam who was martyred and has great reverence in the Shia Islam, in the Islamic world. And they go there, and the way he prays and meditates there greatly influences Mulla Sadiq. So from that point on, Mulla Sadiq sort of gets this hint that this person that his uncle says is not paying attention to his religious study is really a great personage, is a great individual being. Given that Mulla Sadiq was far advanced in his studies, after a short period of time, he finishes his religious studies and earns this great honorific title of Mujtahid. He becomes a grand Mujtahid, and then he leaves Iraq and goes back to Iran. But before leaving, he, with the other students, they sort of make a pact, particularly with Quddus and with Mullah Hussein, that because Sayyid Kazim and Sheikh Ahmad had said in their schools, they had educated them to be prepared for the coming of this great personage, this promised one, that if any of them, in their search learns of such a personage, would let the other people know. They make a pact and they leave, and then each of them go their own way. Shortly after that, of course, Sheikh Kazim passes away, and the other students, including Quddus and Mullah Hussein, leave the area. From the history of the Babi Faith, you know that how the Mullah Hussein comes to meet the Bab in Shiraz and becomes the first believer. And initially 18 people, without having met the Bab, through correspondence, learn about the new revelation. And the Bab starts, writing, these new books, new epistles, and asks his disciples to study it. But this is a period, the first few months of the revelation, that the Bab instructs his believers not to reveal the Bab's identity to anyone, but just speak about this new revelation, the new concepts in this revelation, and sort of prepare the masses that they come in contact with. About 2 months after the revelation of the Bab sends Mullah Hussein to another city in the north, city of Isfahan. And at this time, Mulla Sadiq, who had been in the eastern province of Khurasan for about a couple of months, makes a trip to Isfahan, and there, after a couple of years, meets Mullah Hussein. Old friends, they embrace, and they are so happy to see each other. And then Mullah Sadiq asked Mullah Hussein that, what news do you have? You remember we make this pact that if any of us comes to about, such a personage, such a new revelation, we would, inform each other. And Mullah Hussein removes a piece of paper out of his pocket and gives it to Mulla Sadiq Mugaddas Khurasani and says that there is this personage in Shiraz, and he has written these things. See what you think about it. Mulla Sadiq pulls out the paper, starts reading of it, and says that I have to go to my room and study this. He goes to his room. Next day comes back, visits Mullah Hussein again, and says, what is the claim of this person? And Mullah Hussein says that he claims to be the promised one of Islam, promised one of Shia. According to their expectations, they expected the coming of the 12th Imam, the return of the 12th Imam. And he says that is his claim. Mullah Sadiq looks at it and he said, the person who has written this cannot be a 12th Imam. He must be a major manifestation of God. So at that point, without having met the Bab, without having read much about it, just from reading 2 pages, which was the first chapter of the first writing of the Bab, Suratul Mulk, Mullah Hussein, Mullah Sadiq has that kind of integrity of thought, purity of motive, and sharpness of spirit, keen spirit, that he recognizes the person who has uttered this must be a manifestation of God and not just station of an imam. Again, that day ends, he goes to his room, and the next day comes back and says that, who is this person? And Mullah Hussein says that at this point, we are not allowed to reveal the identity of this person. Mullah Sadiq turns to him and says that, I think this must be the person that we were in the school of, in Karbala, we were classmates. And he remembers the Bab. He says, this must be that person. When he says that, Mullah Hussein removes another paper out of his pocket, and he says, actually, this letter is for you. The Bab has written it for you and asks you to go to Shiraz and meet him. So Mullah Sadiq, out of reverence, starts towards Shiraz on foot. On the way, praying and meditating to prepare himself in order to meet the Bab. And he goes there and he meets the Bab. The Bab meets him, embraces him, and assigns a couple of things to him. One is that the Bab tells him to go to a mosque and add a phrase to the call to prayer of Islam. Those of you who have lived in Islamic countries, you know that 5 times a day you hear this call to prayer. They call it in Persian and Arabic azan, calling the believers to be ready and perform their obligatory prayer. And also the Bab instructs Mullah Sadiq during the prayer to turn away, because they pray towards Mecca, right? To turn away from there and pray towards house of the Bab, an indication that now there is a new manifestation has come. Now, friends, those of you who are familiar with the Islamic faith, you know that there are no greater institutions in Islam than obligatory prayer and Qibla, the point of adoration, Mecca. And there are stories upon stories in Islamic history about things that have happened to Muslims, Islamic army when they were engaging in battles with other places, when they were engaged in obligatory prayer, that nothing would shake them, nothing would break them, to make any change whatsoever to it. So the fact that the Bab assigned these 2 tasks to Mullah Sadiq shows the confidence that he had in him, and confidence in his steadfastness, because they knew what would happen to him. So Mulla Sadiq goes with another believer, Mulla Ali Akbar Aristani. They go to this mosque, and because of his erudition and piety, he was very famous. Wherever he went, any city that he went, the local clergy would beg him to go and be the leading speaker and religious leader in that particular mosque. So the first few days that Mulla Sadiq was in Shiraz, he goes to a mosque, but then he changes the mosque from where he was making his sermons to a mosque that was very close to the house of the Bab. He goes there and adds a phrase to the azan, to the obligatory prayer, it's a call to the prayer that says, essentially, the remnant of God, Baqiyatullah, what they call, has now appeared. And during this, he also changes from, they are facing Mecca, changes, towards facing house of the Bab. Of course, there's this commotion, the word spread throughout the city and all that, and the clergy start complaining and all that, and they complain to the governor, Mirza Hussein Khan, and governor gives into the pressure of this clergy, and they arrest these two individuals, Mulla Sadiq and Mulla Ali Akbar, and they are tortured severely. They are dragged through the streets of the city for hours, and things that, it's difficult to say it. It's very gruesome things. Torture they do to these individuals, and they imprison them for a while, but out of the reverence for the station of Mulla Sadiq, they do not put them to death, and they release them, but they tell them that you have to leave the city. So Mulla Sadiq and Mulla Akbar, they leave the city, and Mulla Sadiq goes towards another province, Khurasan, but the Bab had given him another assignment, weighty assignment, and that was to go to one of the leading figures of Shaky / Shia clergy by the name of Haj Karim Khan Kermani, goes to another city of Kerman, to proclaim the new faith to him. Now, this Haj Karim Khan was very notorious. He was probably one of the most powerful religious and political figures of his time, because he was very wealthy. He had large pieces of land and resources and all that. He was from the Qajar family, and that's why he was so influential. He was also had done religious studies and was one of the leading figures who considered himself to be a successor to Sayyid Kazim Reshdi. And people, clergy and regular people and political people, were utterly afraid of him. Even when people have written that people would go to his house or to his school or whatever, they would shake because in his presence. Mulla Sadiq goes to him and proclaims the new faith to this man. And he stays in Kerman for several weeks, and he teaches the new faith to a number of great Shaykhi students from the old days, and many of them accept the new faith. So this becomes the beginning of the life of the services of Mulla Sadiq that continues for many years to come. When one reads the story of the life and services of Mulla Sadiq, one cannot help to think of people like Peter and Paul, to the degree that they were influential in spreading Christianity. The 13 letters that Paul wrote to various places and established churches, in Rome and Thessalonica and in Antioch and other places, and also the services that Peter performed. We see that the immensity of the services that Mulla Sadiq performed in proclaiming this new revelation is on par or even surpasses. It succeeds, surpasses those earlier records and efforts. I'll mention just a few of them. Nathan John, how much time? I keep talking and
Don't worry, you have plenty of time. The only thing we want is at the end to have some space for questions and answers.
Yes, of course.
And our plan is to finish in 37 minutes from now.
Okay, but of the time that not considering the time for question and answer, how much
please
more?
Talk freely. It's another 20, 25
No, just
no, it's starting to become juicy now, so don't stop.
Okay. All right, sorry about it. And I mentioned why this is the case. I'll just give you a few examples why the services of this man is of such magnitude in the Babi Faith and later in the Baha'i Faith. Not only he served this new revelation and spread the teachings of this new faith, but he also taught a number of people who later on, in their own terms, they became great teachers and promoters of the new revelation, of new religion. He is the father of Ibn Asdaq, his son, who, by all accounts that we know of, is the first person that has been called hand of the cause. Those of you who are familiar with this terminology in the Baha'i Faith, hands of the cause were appointed by Baha'u'llah and later on by the guardian of the Baha'i Faith, Shaky Effendi, and Abdul Baha posthumously gave the title of hand of the cause to some of the friends who had passed away, but he did not appoint anyone as hands. Interestingly enough, the first tablet that we come across in which the title hand of the cause is used to the son of this Mulla Sadiq. That Mulla Sadiq taught him the faith and raised him to serve this new revelation, new cause. Mulla Sadiq also, Baha'u'llah during his lifetime appointed 4 individuals as hands of the cause. One of them was son of Mulla Sadiq, who was known as Ibn Asdaq, the son of Asdaq. One of them is Mulla Ali Akbar Shahmizadi, who was taught the faith by Mulla Sadiq. More than important perhaps than that, Mulla Sadiq was the one who taught the faith, the revelation, first of the Babi revelation, and later on the faith of Baha'i Faith, revelation of Baha'u'llah, to a number of the relatives of the Bab, to the uncles of the Bab and other relatives, who in turn, they arose and served this new revelation in magnificent ways. People like Afnani Kabir and others who had come in contact with him, with Mulla Sadiq in Karbala and other places, and they had such a reverence for him. That's why they paid attention to what he was saying, and that's why Mulla Sadiq was able to teach them this new revelation. Mirza Muhammad Taqi Wakil-ud-Dawla of the Afnanis, who later on became the architect and builder of the first house of worship in Russia, in Turkmenistan, was taught the faith by Mulla Sadiq. When Mulla Sadiq was in Khurasan and he was teaching the faith, it caused so much agitation among the clergy that they went to the governor and they complained to him, and governor arrested him. But because of his fame and his piety, his popularity, they could not do any harm to him, but they exiled them and sent them to prison to Tehran. So Mulla Sadiq spends over 2 years in prison in Tehran, and his son, Muhammad Ali, who later on was known as Ibn Asdaq, was about 8 years old. When they were in prison, this young child falls ill, and the Shia doctors, physicians, they refuse to treat him. So they look around and they find a Jewish physician who was also a court physician. He was very expert. He agrees to come and treat this child for several months. And during these visits that he would come every few days to treat the child, during these visits, Mulla Sadiq teaches him the faith. And that person becomes the first Jewish person who accepts the faith, and he himself teaches scores of people from Jewish faith. You know him as Masih Elahi, Hakim Masih Mirza Musa, that later on gets the title of Hakim Elahi or Hakim Masih. So this is a significant development because later on, this Mirza Musa teaches many, as I mentioned, people from the Jewish persuasion in places like Tehran, in Kashan, Hamadan, and other places. Another important task that Baha'u'llah assigns to Mulla Sadiq, because again of the trust that he had, is that there was a period that the remains of the Bab, as you know, when the Bab was executed in Tabriz, his remains, it took about 50 years before his remains were transferred to Palestine and interred in its eternal resting place on Mount Carmel. There were on some occasions that the remains of the Bab that was hidden in different places were to be identified, or the location were to be disclosed. And Baha'u'llah wrote to Mulla Sadiq, trusting him to make arrangements to move it from one place to another, so people would not find its location. So the preservation and protection of the remains of the Bab was also one of the tasks that this great man was entrusted. There is hardly any city or town when you read the history of the faith that Mulla Sadiq in Iran, that Mulla Sadiq did not travel to. So it is not exaggeration to say that he literally was the cause of teaching of thousands of early believers, both during the Babi dispensation and later on during the Baha'i dispensation. The Bab, in one of his writings, wrote to Mulla Sadiq and said that on the day of resurrection, you will come to witness the countenance of God. On one occasion, when Baha'u'llah was in Baghdad, Mulla Sadiq travels to Baghdad, meets Baha'u'llah. This is early part of Baha'u'llah's stay in Baghdad, and immediately accepts the Baha'i Faith after meeting with Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah writes him a tablet and repeats the same phrase that the Bab had written to Mulla Sadiq, an Arabic phrase that said, Fi yawm al-bada' tilqa al-wajh, that on the day of resurrection, you will come to see the countenance of the beloved. And Baha'u'llah reminds him, what the Bab had said. He stays there. He actually was with his family, Mulla Sadiq, with his son, with his wife, and other children. He stays there for several weeks. And after that, Baha'u'llah sends him back to Iran to go and spread the faith, again, teach the faith throughout. So I think at this point, I'll just stop because this, the story is so vast and so many details about the life of this great individual.
So there are some questions here that maybe will encourage the friends to put their mics out of mute and ask themselves. But I'll start with this. There is an analogy of the beginning of the Christian revelation with the apostles and what Mullah Hussein, and of course the letters of living, the 18th that followed the Bab, started in Iran at that time by spreading the faith. But one big difference is the fact that most of the followers of Christ and probably all apostles were very meek, very simple men. Many were illiterate, and they really followed their master by example and with love, and they spread the faith, but they didn't have such a status or a position to lose when they accepted the manifestation. Mulla Sadiq, although he wasn't very old, he already had encompassed a notorious name and respect. So not only it was a challenging thing, but what happened to the community of the clergymen in Iran? When someone like him accepts, isn't it natural that beside the opposition, there are also people that immediately follow him, just out of sheer respect for his knowledge?
Yes, very much so. Very, very good point, dear Nissan. That's why I like to compare him, although I think it's not an adequate comparison. But if you were to compare him to disciples of Christianity, perhaps it would be more adequate to say his work resembles that of the Paul and not the first 12 apostles. Because Paul was not part of the early apostles. He himself was a Roman citizen, and he could travel. And in fact, he was one who initially, and this part of it has nothing to do with Mulla Sadiq, but initially he had, tortured some Christians, but then he apparently, according to stories, had some vision of Christ and change of heart and all that. And but he was quite literate. And in fact, the form of Christianity, the theology of Christianity that we have today is primarily because of the teachings of Paul. Because he was quite learned. He wrote his letters. As you know, there are 13 books of the New Testament. They called epistles, the 13 epistles of Paul to different, churches, places that he had established. And the process of canonization in Christianity was highly influenced by what Paul believed and what Paul taught. Because there were other disciples who had written also their gospels, their what they remembered from the life of Jesus Christ and all that. But the ones that were accepted, that became part of the canon of Christianity, were the ones that were sort of in line with the theology that Paul was preaching and developing. So, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas is not included in the canon of the New Testament because there were some issues that differed with what Paul taught. In any event, Paul was one of the very few people that was educated. But as you mentioned, in this new revelation, people like Mulla Sadiq were of different stature. And because of his stature, the people who gravitated, although there were many people also who were very simple and not highly educated, who accepted the new faith, but a large number of highly educated people of the time accepted the faith because of people like, or particularly because of people like, Mulla Sadiq, because they had such a respect for him. As I mentioned, the uncle of the Bab, before this new revelation, he goes there because of the respect that he has for Mulla Sadiq, and trusts the Bab to Mulla Sadiq and ask him to assist him, encourage him to be studious, to pay attention to his studies. And a number of people, these maternal uncles of the Bab were educated themselves. And Mulla Sadiq, in many places, when he traveled, he met with the clergy because they gravitated towards him. They had heard of two things about him: of his immense knowledge, he was a great mujtahid, and also his piety. He got the title of Sadiq, and later on Mugaddas, means the most holy. This was because of it. He went to many places. Later on, he travels to actually Akka. Baha'u'llah, towards the end of when he was towards the end of his life, Mulla Sadiq, Baha'u'llah summons him to go to Akka, and he goes to Akka, and he stays there for a few months. And Baha'u'llah sends him back, to Iran. Again, he travels to different places. He stays in Hamadan for 12 days, and unfortunately there in Hamadan he passes away. But in all these places on the way, not only in Iran, but also other places in the Ottoman realm of that time, in Syria and in Iraq, and of course in Palestine, Mulla Sadiq made with these scholars, and among them, as I mentioned, people who became hands of the cause, and other great scholars that met him, and later on became great scholars of this new faith. So in that sense, yes, there is this distinction between the early believers of Christianity, many of whom were not really educated, and these great scholars of this Islam that accepted. And these were people, when I say scholars, things that they studied in those days, aside from religious studies, they would study the history of religions, they would study philosophy, but both Islamic philosophy and Greek philosophy, because Islamic scholars had translated many books from Greek into Arabic, the works of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and New Platonians and others that these people studied. So they were familiar, and they studied also logic, what they called mantiq. So these were different sciences that they studied, and they truly mastered it. And so Mulla Sadiq was truly remarkable in each of these fields, and that's why he had become a great mujtahid.
So apart from his, let's say, traditional studies as a Muslim scholar, after he accepted the cause of the Bab and the cause of Baha'u'llah, we know that the odds of him not being killed and becoming a martyr were very small, for his proeminence, and also for the fact that he was a staunch teacher of the cause. And I think those of us that can imagine what is the courage of and faith, really, that someone has to go in the mosque and do what he did. But through all his life, he survived, and he became a great teacher. So would you say that because he was always traveling and teaching, his side of a scholar, he wasn't writing, that's what I mean. So there is no book or writings or summaries of his understanding of this new cause at that time, or you're not aware of anything such as a book or something that he has written about his experiences?
No, you're right. We don't. But from the tablets that we have, the letters that Baha'u'llah, well, first the Bab, and then later on Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha wrote to him, or not Abdul Baha, about him, I should say, because Abdul Baha was alive at the time, but when Mulla Sadiq passed away, this was, I believe it was in 1874. So this was years before Baha'u'llah passed away.
Can I ask a question? Nason, can I ask a question?
Yes, please, friends. I forgot, I wrote everyone, Dr. Afnani, but I wrote everyone that please interrupt or ask any questions you want, please. Yes.
So, Janab Afnani, really enjoyed listening to you, and it's great to see you. We see very little of you in this day and age, so this is a pleasure.
Pleasure.
And a privilege. I wanted to ask you, see if you can talk a little bit about the conference of Badasht and whether Mulla Sadiq was a participant in Badasht.
That's a good question. I don't recall. Does anyone remember him? Because I know that Mulla Sadiq was one of the survivors of Sheikh Tabarsi. But whether later he went to Badasht or not, I don't recall that.
Yeah, I can't recall it. So I was wondering if.
Yeah.
Okay.
in his, as I remember in his biography, because several people have written about him, but probably aside from the things that are in the writings of the faith from Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha, the primary source is the biography that his son Ibn Asdaq wrote. I have to go back and look at it, but at this point I do not recall reading about that he attended that. But I could be mistaken. What was interesting, I was trying to point out to this that Mulla Sadiq, we should say really one of the great accomplishments of Mulla Sadiq was the education of his son. Because his son, in his own turn, performed amazing services, not only being one of the hands of the cause, maybe perhaps the first hand of the cause, but in doing a number of other things. For instance, he was emissary of Abdul Baha to the Peace Conference of Hague. Abdul Baha dispatched, at the time he was an old man, Abdul Baha. He was influential in establishing some of the first early institutions of the faith, Mount Carmel. He, having been married to his wife being one of the relatives, distant relatives from the Qajar dynasty, Ibn Asdaq was able to associate with some of these progressive thinkers of Qajar dynasty, some of whom had traveled to Europe, and they had these questions about the changes that had occurred in Europe with the, obviously the French Revolution, and changes that also had happened in Ottoman Empire as a result of these Tanzimat and all that. And it appears that these people would ask him some questions to bring to Abdul Baha, or write to Abdul Baha, and in turn get the responses from Abdul Baha and convey it to these princes of Qajar. So this is also something that really is we should think of it as one of the accomplishments of Mulla Sadiq, having raised such a thing. Mulla Sadiq endured so much hardship that Baha'u'llah gave him the title of the martyr. And also his son Ibn Asdaq also served so much and endured so much hardship and wished to be martyred for, in the path of, this revelation, that he also earned the title of martyr, although neither of them were martyred. That's why his name is the martyr, and Mulla Asdaq is known as the martyr, son of the martyr, Shahid and Shahid ibn Shahid. I want to read, if it is okay, just one sentence to you. See that what Baha'u'llah said to Mulla Sadiq with all these things that he did. Because Baha'u'llah always encouraged the friends not to be satisfied with the status quo. In many of the tablets, Baha'u'llah referred to Mulla Sadiq as the manifestation of my faithfulness. Called him, or truthfulness. He called him, for instance, a mazhar sadqam, or center, or manifestation of my faithfulness. On one occasion, it says, O manifestation of my faithfulness, if thou art sleep upon thy couch, lift up thy head, and if thou art seated, arise in the power of my name, and if thou art standing, soar in the heaven for the longing of my beauty, and if thou art flying, ascend to the sovereignty of my might, and if thou art ascending, arrive upon thy station in the heaven of the spirit. This is a provisional translation, but this was the type of man that earned the appellation of martyr.
Friends, please put your mic out of mute and ask whatever you want, because I know it's a unique opportunity tonight, having Dr. Afnani here with us.
Nathan, sorry, I've neglected to mention one thing. As I was talking about these, making analogy between the events and prophecies in Europe in terms of the evolution and progress that was taking place, and also in Iran. When I mentioned these students in the school of Sheikh Kazem and the things that they did, and particularly Mulla Sadiq, where they were going around, what they were saying is that the change has to be in the religious field, that we should put away this blind imitation of clergy. It's what we call taqlid. Because, you know, in Shia Islam, they had divided, you know, the community in the centers of authority, which were mujtahids, and then the rest of the population were the followers. They had to emulate, they had to follow the edicts of these people. There's no other way. Either you are mujtahid yourself or you have to follow a mujtahid. Right? And these new thinkers, including Mulla Sadiq, what they were preaching to the populace was that all aspects of life in the Islamic countries, and in particularly in Iran, is affected by the religious views. Whether you look at the economic, you look at the relationship with the court system, and all of these, they are heavily influenced by the clergy and religious thoughts. And if you want to bring meaningful change and progress to the country, this traditional view of clergy and religion has to change, has to evolve. As long as people are treated as sheep and goats, and they are not allowed to have their own thoughts and think and decide for themselves, no meaningful change will happen. So they were prescribing this evolution or revolution really in the religious field in Iran. They said because it has penetrated, even like as I mentioned, economics. They said that, okay, the clergy have so much influence in the economic system, in the bazaar system, that nothing can be done. So unless that underlying force, that underlying structure, which is religious, changes, these things will not change. And that's what people like Mulla Sadiq, was teaching and preaching, to the people in Iran. I'm sorry.
No, it's very pertinent and extremely interesting to know that someone that was a mujtahid, that put aside all this status to accept the faith, is enrolling a faith that actually doesn't have any place for clergy, right? But I think there are more people asking. I mean, maybe, I don't know if the dear Khodadus in Denmark want to ask something.
Yeah, I have some questions. I mean, I have some statements. In 2006, I published a book regarding Mulla Sadiq Ibn Sadiq, and it's about some 400 or 500, and about 300 of tablets, and the letter of Ibn Sadiq, and all the researchers and the writings by Dr. Wahid Rafati. And yes, it's a rare document. And then at the same time, what we read, for instance, we have the tablet of Bob to a small law. He says, you go and change the azan and turn it to the house, old house, and say this and this and that. So everything is according to that.
Yes, thank you.
So
yes.
It's only very strange. The name is Peike Ralston.
Yes.
It is Ralston is exactly the title of Mulla Sadiq and Ibn Sadiq. And this is the letters, writings of the things. But it's a very sad thing that the descendants of Ibn Sadiq and Mulla Sadiq, that these two young gentlemen, their fathers are Persians and they didn't know Persian. Otherwise, they would have known much better than all the things. Yeah, they should all study it. Fortunately, there is another great grandson who is Dominique Bruckshaw, and he's asked that maybe he would translate the whole 500 in English with all the tablets.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq Khanum. I know of you, but I've never had the bounty of meeting you. I'm so glad to see you today.
My name is Minu. Minu Khoda dost
Oh,
Khurasani.
vale.
Speaking of change, I'd like to ask a question that is not related necessarily to Mulla Sadiq, and I'd like to tell you that luckily I can't get my image on this business. Anyway, my question to you is, what do you attribute the popularity of the Middle Eastern and Islamic studies in the American and maybe German universities at the time that especially the evangelists are questioning even the source of Islam or Muhammad?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think it's difficult to make definitive statements on it because it requires really proper research and study. What I do know is that a number of Islamic countries, they provide funding to major universities. For instance, in the United States, most of the universities, major universities that have those type of studies, whether in the East Coast or West Coast or elsewhere, you know, they get major fundings and grants to engage in such studies. So particularly these fields of study that are speculative in nature and they are not hard science are in need of always, you know, funding. So that is a great reason for it. Obviously, curiosity is another reason. And also, from some of the experiences that I have had in different settings, I know that many in the Western world are willing to bend backward to find people with whom they can have, from the Muslim field, from the Muslim world rather, to have cordial discourse and learn about this area. So these are among some of the reasons, but these are just, you know, the cup, you know, without really having done proper research about it. I can just say subjectively.
Dr. Afnani, Mrs. Khodadous mentioned Peyker Rastan, this book.
Yes.
Do you know if there are any plans of translation of this book into English? Talking on behalf of the family members that are illiterate in Farsi.
Well, I do not know if there, at this point, I do not know of that. There may be, I do not know. But a few of these tablets have already been either in its entirety or part of them have already been translated. But most of them have not, because between Ismullah and Ibn Asda, from the 5 holy figures of the faith, from the Bab, Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and Greatest Holy Leaf, we have, as Minu Khanum mentioned, more than 300 some pieces of writings. It's quite extensive, and I have seen some of these in some of the tablets that have been translated, but not as a collection. Obviously, many of them have not. Maybe Minu Khanum knows of those type of efforts, but I'm not aware.
Friends, we have time for another last question. And if God willing, we'll be able to be blessed with Dr. Afnani's presence, maybe this year, maybe next year. I haven't told him yet, but my plan was to have a second part. Maybe we could have about Ibn Astah, but That could be later. Now, is there anybody that has not asked yet that would like to ask a question? Maybe Talia? I feel her urge to say something. No? Okay, I'm reading wrongly your face. Maybe someone else. We have Claudia from Brazil. We have Shahnaz Khanum from Vancouver. Whoever has a last question, please be my guest.
Dear Nathan, I would like to ask a question, please. First, I would like to thank very much Dr. Afnani for this very enlightening talk, and congratulate you, Nathan, for this initiative. And of course, I'm fortunate to be able to be participating in this event from Brazil, from Brasilia, where we miss you very much, Nathan. You and your family, of course. So my question is this. Some time ago, I made a very good friend who happened to be the ambassadress of Pakistan to Brazil. And she asked me a question, knowing that I am a Baha'i. She's now back in Pakistan, but we used to have some very good conversations about the Baha'i faith and religion. And she asked me, where in the Quran is the prophecy that a new revelation would come? And of course, I couldn't answer her because I'm not so familiar with the Quran, having been raised as a Catholic. So I would like to ask Dr. Afnani if is there any sentence in the Quran that clearly says there will be a new revelation after Muhammad?
Yes, there are, but because of the number of them, it's probably better if I send maybe some references to Nathan John, and then he can, share it with you. One may wonder that if there are these type of things, why then, people are not accepting the new revelation? And that it is clear because people read the text, the Quranic text, and then they look at it differently. For instance, there is a statement in one of the surahs of Quran that it says, "O children of men, there will be new prophets that will come, manifestations that will come, and they will reveal to you the revelation," right? But because it says, "O children of men, Ya Bani Adam," the Islamic clergy interpret that as this having been said to the children of Adam and doesn't apply to the present. However, that is not accurate because immediately before this sentence, it says, "O children of Adam, when you enter masjid," meaning mosque, "remove your ornaments." Right. So clearly, masjid is a term that is Islamic. The word did not exist as a place of worship. Islamic place of worship did not exist before Islam. So this clearly cannot be have not been addressed to the children of Adam, but it applies to that time. But I mean, there are reasons like this that they read it differently. But I will be there are, as you know, many books on apologetics that have been written about these type of things, about Islam or Christianity or other things. And I can send some of the sources through email perhaps to Naysanjan, and then we can forward it to you.
Thank you very much. I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Claudia. I will be glad to send you by email whatever Dr. Afnani shares with me. Any other question? That was the last question, but I'm stretching here the time. Maybe perhaps with your permission, Dr. Afnani, we could have a last question.
Sure, please.
Someone else? Yes.
I think Minu Khanum is trying to say something. Maybe we lost it.
Just mute, Minu.
Farhang
I was just Well, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Afnan, but at the same time, I was going to say to Minu to dismute herself because she's muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or this.
I think.
Yeah, Minu.
And I'm surprised, Minujan. It's quite late or
No,
it's
it's okay.
early
It's
on
okay.
Monday.
You know, I just wanted to give a reference, this book of Muin, Scriptures and Revelations. And one of the part of this book is the holy about the Yomullah. And there are many, many references in Quran and all other religions that from page 171 and 217 by Khaze Fanapazi. It's completely written, everything, all the references, Quran and others, especially Quran, and it's all called Yomullah, the day of God. That is mentioned.
Thank you. Thanks so much for those of you that don't know them. Minujan and Irajan from the Khodadus family are the third
thank
generation.
you for the picture.
Are the third generation from Mulla Sadiq. They live in Denmark. Their dear mother, was one of the 4 daughters of Ibn Astah. So, Dr. Afnani, with that, I should just thank you and from my heart, really, and maybe ask if you have a few last words, and otherwise feel free to actually close your fireside tonight.
Thank you. Just wanted to again express my gratitude for this occasion and to meet through this medium some of the illustrious members of this illustrious man, or men, we should say, and of course, like Minu Khanum mentioned, daughters of Ibn Astah. Abdullah loved Ibn Astah so much.
Yes.
Abdullah had 4 daughters. Ibn Astah had 4 daughters, and they were always in communication with each other. And several times they would go there, and Abdullah would keep them there. And this love and relationship developed among them. And really, the entire Baha'i world is indebted to the work of this Mulla Sadiq.
And at the same time,
Family,
these 14.
So many people.
Sorry, Mr. Khodadus, you're mute. You're in mute. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
In this stuff.
No. No, she just said that the family have been to visiting Abdul Baha in 72 days.
1914.
In 1914.
All the doctors, yeah.
They went on, I mean, I have read in the history that they went on several occasions. Maybe that was the last time that several occasions they did this. I'm sure you know better about it, and I understand that Nesanjan was saying that
yes.
Mrs. Azam also has talked about.
Yes, we will have another fireside connected to this. That is Ms. Fat Azam talking about her memories and from the family memories of her mother, of course, and the stories of Ibn Astah shared with her. And this will be a set of historic firesides in which our aim and purpose is to perpetuate what they started, which is actually teaching the cause by showing the relationship between the first disciples of Christ and the first disciples of the Bab, and bridging the same magnitude of attraction that made them leave everything they had and start their journey in this cause that is going on now through their descendants. So thank you again, Dr. Afnani. Thank you for all of you here, particularly those that are in time zones that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Late
So
night.
lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Thank you, Dr. Afnani. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
See you soon, I hope. Bye-bye. And remember, we'll have this on YouTube, so you can send it to your friends and teach the faith using this instrument.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.